Margaret sat at her small kitchen table every morning at exactly 6:30, sipping coffee from the same blue mug she had used for the past 10 years. The sunlight crept through her window curtains as she prepared for another day that would look exactly like yesterday and the day before that. She lived in a tiny apartment above the old bakery on Main Street, where the smell of fresh bread always filled the air in the early hours. At 42 years old, Margaret had settled into a life that felt safe but empty. She worked as the town librarian, a job she had held for 15 years, since moving to this quiet place. Every day she walked the same route to work, passing the same houses and greeting the same people with polite nods. The library was her kingdom, filled with thousands of books that had become her closest companions over the years. Margaret was not like the other women in town who spent their mornings at the gym or their evenings at social gatherings. She preferred the quiet company of her 2 cats, Whiskers and Mittens, who followed her around the apartment like loyal shadows. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman who had given up trying to impress anyone. Her brown hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the same style of loose-fitting clothes that hid her larger frame. The people in town knew Margaret as the helpful librarian who could find any book and answer any question, but they rarely saw her as anything more than that. She had become invisible in the way that quiet people often do, blending into the background of everyday life. Children would run past her on the street without a second glance, and adults would nod politely but never stop to have a real conversation. Margaret spent her lunch breaks sitting alone in the library garden, eating sandwiches she packed at home, while reading romance novels about women who lived exciting lives. She often wondered what it would feel like to be brave enough to take risks or strong enough to stand out in a crowd. These thoughts came and went like clouds passing overhead, never staying long enough to inspire any real change. Her evenings followed the same pattern every single day. She would walk home from work, feed her cats, prepare a simple dinner, and then settle into her worn armchair with a book. The television stayed off most nights because Margaret preferred the silence and the world she could visit through reading. By 9 o'clock she was in bed, setting her alarm for another identical day. On weekends, Margaret would venture out to buy groceries or visit the small bookstore on the corner, but these trips were brief and functional rather than enjoyable. She had learned to move through the world without attracting attention, keeping her head down and her voice soft. The mirror in her bedroom reflected a woman who had forgotten what it felt like to feel proud of herself. Margaret had not always been this way. As a child, she had been active and curious, climbing trees and running races with the other kids in her neighborhood. But somewhere along the way, life had taught her to be careful, to stay safe, and to avoid taking chances that might lead to disappointment or embarrassment. The years had passed quietly, and she had accepted that this small, predictable life was probably all she deserved. Her apartment was filled with books, but empty of dreams. The walls were bare except for a few old photographs of family members she rarely spoke to anymore. Margaret had convinced herself that she was content with this simple existence, even though something deep inside her occasionally whispered that there might be more to life than just surviving each day. As she finished her coffee that morning and prepared for another ordinary day at the library, Margaret had no idea that everything was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. Tuesday morning started like every other morning for Margaret until she walked past the community center on her way to work. A bright red poster caught her eye, standing out against the old brick wall like a flame in the darkness. She stopped walking and moved closer to read the bold letters that seemed to jump off the paper. Heartfelt Fitness, CHALLENG. Open to all ages and fitness levels. Grand prize winner gets $5,000, plus trophies for multiple categories. Registration starts today. Margaret stood frozen in front of the poster, reading every single word twice. The details explained that the challenge would include rope climbing, obstacle courses, endurance running, strength tests, and agility drills. Participants would compete in different age groups, and there were prizes for everyone who finished the complete course. The event was scheduled for 6 weeks away, giving people time to prepare and train. As Margaret continued reading, she heard voices approaching from behind. 3 young women in expensive workout clothes were walking toward the community center, their conversation growing louder as they got closer. They wore matching athletic shoes that probably cost more than Margaret spent on clothes in 3 months, and their bodies looked like they belonged in fitness magazines. The first woman, a blonde with perfectly styled hair even at 8 in the morning, laughed as she pointed at the poster. She told her friends that this challenge would be easier than their regular gym workouts. The second woman, wearing bright pink leggings, agreed and said she could probably win without even training extra. The third woman suggested they should all enter just for fun and maybe use the prize money for a vacation. Margaret stepped aside as the women approached the poster, feeling suddenly aware of her loose gray sweater and comfortable walking shoes. She pretended to look at other notices on the community board while listening to their conversation. They discussed which categories they would dominate and laughed about how the older participants would probably need help just finishing the course. One of the women noticed Margaret standing nearby and smiled in the way people do when they are being polite but not really interested. She asked Margaret if she was thinking about entering the challenge too, and her tone suggested she found the idea amusing rather than encouraging. Margaret felt her cheeks grow warm as she mumbled something about just reading the announcements. The women continued talking among themselves, mentioning names of other fit people in town who would probably compete. They discussed training schedules and workout plans, like they were planning a casual shopping trip. Margaret realized that these women had never doubted their ability to succeed at physical challenges, while she had spent years avoiding anything that might test her limits. After the women walked into the community center, Margaret remained alone with the poster. She read the words again, paying special attention to the phrase that said the challenge was open to all fitness levels. Something stirred inside her chest, a feeling she had not experienced in many years. It was curiosity mixed with longing, like discovering a door she had never noticed before. Margaret remembered being 12 years old and climbing the tallest tree in her neighborhood park. She had been fearless then, scrambling up branches while other kids stayed safely on the ground. She recalled the feeling of accomplishment when she reached the top and could see the whole town spread out below her. That brave little girl seemed like a completely different person now. As she finally walked away from the poster and continued toward the library, Margaret could not stop thinking about the fitness challenge. The idea followed her through her morning routine of checking returned books and helping patrons find what they needed. During her lunch break, instead of reading her usual romance novel, she found herself staring out the window and wondering what it would feel like to surprise everyone, including herself. The seed of possibility had been planted, and Margaret spent the rest of the day trying to ignore how much it intrigued her. For 3 days and 3 nights, Margaret could not get the fitness challenge out of her mind. She found herself thinking about it while sorting books, during her quiet dinners, and even when she tried to fall asleep. The poster had awakened something that had been sleeping inside her for years, and now it refused to be ignored. On Friday afternoon, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of walking straight home from work, she turned toward the community center with determination in her steps. Her heart was beating faster than usual, and her hands felt sweaty despite the cool autumn air. She had changed from her work clothes into a simple blue dress and cardigan, the nicest outfit she owned. The community center was busy with the usual afternoon crowd. Young mothers were picking up their children from after-school programs, and teenagers were heading to various activities. The registration table for the fitness challenge was set up near the main entrance, surrounded by people who looked like they spent every free moment at the gym. Margaret approached the table slowly, taking in the scene around her. Athletic men and women were filling out forms while discussing their training routines and past competition experiences. Everyone seemed to know exactly what they were doing, while Margaret felt completely out of place in her everyday clothes and comfortable shoes. The young woman behind the registration table was the same blonde who had been at the poster earlier that week. She was wearing a tight workout top that showed off her toned arms, and her smile was bright and confident. When Margaret reached the front of the line, The woman looked up expectantly, probably assuming Margaret was there to ask questions or register someone else. Margaret cleared her throat quietly and said she wanted to sign up for the fitness challenge. The words came out softer than she intended, almost like a whisper. The registration woman looked confused and asked Margaret to repeat herself. When Margaret spoke again, a little louder this time, several people nearby turned to listen. The blonde woman tilted her head and asked if Margaret was registering for a family member or friend. Her tone was polite but carried a hint of doubt, as if the idea of Margaret participating herself was hard to believe. Margaret felt her face growing hot as she explained that she wanted to enter the competition personally. A moment of awkward silence followed before the woman behind the table smiled and said how wonderful it was that Margaret wanted to try something new. Her words sounded encouraging, but her expression suggested she thought Margaret was making a mistake. She handed over the registration form while explaining that the challenges were quite demanding and required serious physical preparation. As Margaret filled out the paperwork, she became aware of whispers starting around her. Two men in running shorts were quietly discussing whether someone Margaret's age and size should really attempt such intense physical challenges. A group of younger women were trying not to laugh as they wondered aloud if Margaret understood what she was getting herself into. The whispers grew louder and more obvious. Margaret heard someone say it was sweet that she wanted to participate, but maybe she should consider starting with something easier like a walking group or beginner yoga class. Another voice suggested that the fitness challenge might be too much for someone who clearly had not exercised in years. Margaret's hands began to shake slightly as she completed the form. Part of her wanted to crumple up the paper and run home to her safe, quiet apartment. The embarrassment was overwhelming, and she could feel dozens of eyes watching her every move. These people saw her as a joke, someone who did not belong in their world of fitness and competition. But something deeper and stronger than embarrassment kept Margaret focused on finishing the registration. Maybe it was the memory of that fearless 12-year-old girl who had climbed the highest tree, or maybe it was simply being tired of living such a small, invisible life. Whatever it was, Margaret signed her name at the bottom of the form and handed it back with a quiet thank you. As she walked away from the registration table, Margaret could still hear the whispers and quiet laughter following her. She had just committed to something that terrified her, and everyone around her seemed to think she was foolish for trying. But for the first time in years, Margaret had done something that required real courage, and that felt more important than what anyone else thought. That evening, Margaret sat in her small living room staring at the registration receipt she had folded carefully in her purse. The reality of what she had done was starting to sink in, and she felt a mixture of excitement and terror that made her stomach flutter like butterflies were dancing inside. She had 6 weeks to prepare for challenges that would test every part of her body, and she had no idea where to begin. Margaret had never owned a computer, but she decided this was important enough to use the one at the library. The next morning, she arrived at work 30 minutes early and searched the internet for fitness training videos and beginner workout plans. She wrote down exercises and tips on small pieces of paper, hiding them in her desk drawer like secret treasure maps to a new version of herself. After work that day, Margaret stopped at the discount store and bought basic workout clothes that would not attract attention. She chose simple black leggings, plain t-shirts, and the cheapest athletic shoes she could find. Standing in the checkout line, she felt like she was buying supplies for an adventure to a foreign country where she did not speak the language. Back in her apartment, Margaret moved her coffee table and pushed her armchair against the wall to create a small exercise space in her living room. Whiskers and Mittens watched with curious eyes as their quiet human began doing strange movements they had never seen before. Margaret started with simple exercises she had found online, trying to follow along with the instructions she had written down. The first workout was harder than Margaret had expected. After just 10 minutes, she was breathing heavily and sweating in ways that reminded her how out of shape she really was. Her muscles ached, and she could barely do 3 push-ups without her arms shaking. But instead of giving up, Margaret felt something she had not experienced in years, a spark of determination that grew stronger with each difficult movement. Every morning before work, Margaret would wake up an hour earlier to exercise in her living room. She started with basic stretches and simple movements, gradually adding more challenging exercises as her body began to remember what it felt like to be active. The cats became her faithful audience, sitting nearby and watching as Margaret huffed and puffed through jumping jacks and attempted sit-ups. Margaret also began changing what she ate, choosing healthier foods and drinking more water throughout the day. She researched nutrition online and learned about foods that would give her energy and help her muscles recover. Instead of her usual evening snacks of cookies and tea, she ate fruits and vegetables while reading about proper training techniques. The hardest part was keeping her new routine secret from everyone around her. At work, Margaret acted the same as always, helping library visitors and organizing books with her usual quiet efficiency. When coworkers mentioned feeling tired or complained about their aches and pains, Margaret bit her tongue to avoid talking about her own sore muscles and early morning workouts. After 3 weeks of consistent training, Margaret began to notice small changes in her body. Her clothes fit differently, and she had more energy during her daily activities. Most importantly, she was sleeping better at night and waking up with a sense of purpose she had forgotten existed. The woman who had lived such a predictable life was discovering that she was capable of discipline and dedication she never knew she possessed. Margaret bought a notebook and started tracking her progress, writing down how many exercises she completed each day and how she felt afterward. Seeing her improvement on paper motivated her to keep pushing forward, even on days when her body felt tired and her mind filled with doubt about whether she could really compete with all those confident, athletic people. The secret training became the most important part of Margaret's day, a time when she was working towards something that belonged entirely to her. 4 weeks into her training, Margaret looked in her bedroom mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at her. Her face had a healthy glow she had not seen in years, and her posture was straighter and more confident. The loose clothes she had always worn to hide her body now hung differently, showing the shape of someone who was becoming stronger every day. The changes went far beyond what Margaret could see in the mirror. She was now able to complete 30 push-ups without stopping, and her morning runs around the neighborhood had progressed from painful shuffling to actual jogging. Her breathing was deeper and easier, and activities that used to tire her out, like carrying heavy boxes of books at work, now felt almost effortless. More importantly, Margaret felt different inside her own mind. The quiet voice that had always told her she was not good enough or strong enough was being replaced by a new voice that whispered about possibilities and potential. She caught herself standing taller when she walked, making eye contact with people instead of looking at the ground, and even smiling at strangers who passed by on the street. Margaret had researched the specific challenges that would be part of the fitness competition and designed her training around each one. For the rope climbing portion, she practiced on a thick rope she hung from the strongest beam in her apartment building's basement. Her hands were covered in blisters at first, but gradually they became calloused and strong enough to support her entire body weight. The obstacle course training happened in her backyard and the nearby park during early morning hours when no one else was around. Margaret practiced crawling under imaginary barriers, jumping over park benches, and weaving between trees to improve her agility and coordination. She felt like a child again, playing games that challenged her body and made her laugh out loud with surprise at her own abilities. For endurance training, Margaret extended her daily runs and added weekend hikes in the hills outside town. She discovered muscles in her legs that had been sleeping for decades and learned to push through the discomfort that came with real physical effort. The woman who had once gotten winded walking up a flight of stairs was now capable of running for miles without stopping. Strength training was the biggest challenge because Margaret could not afford expensive equipment or a gym membership. She got creative, using water jugs filled with sand as weights, doing pull-ups on the monkey bars at the children's playground, and lifting heavy books from the library to build her arm and shoulder muscles. Every household item became a potential piece of exercise equipment in Margaret's determined hands. The mental transformation was even more dramatic than the physical changes. Margaret found herself thinking about problems differently, approaching challenges at work with more confidence and creativity. When difficult library patrons complained or made unreasonable demands, Margaret responded with calm authority instead of nervous apologies. She was becoming someone who believed in her own abilities. Margaret's eating habits had completely changed as well. She now planned meals around protein and vegetables that would fuel her workouts and help her body recover. The woman who used to eat dinner while reading romance novels now spent her evenings researching training techniques and planning the next day's workout routine. Sleep became deeper and more restful as Margaret's body adapted to the daily physical demands she was placing on it. She woke up each morning feeling refreshed and eager to tackle her training, rather than dreading another identical day. The cats noticed the change too, following their energetic human around the apartment with increased curiosity and interest. As the competition date grew closer, Margaret felt a combination of nervousness and excitement that was completely new to her. She was no longer the same woman who had timidly registered for the fitness challenge, while people whispered and laughed around her. The person training in secret every morning was stronger, braver, and more capable than anyone who knew her could possibly imagine. Margaret had discovered that transformation was not just about changing her body, but about changing her entire relationship with herself and what she believed was possible. The morning of the fitness challenge arrived with clear blue skies and perfect weather that seemed designed for competition. Margaret woke up before her alarm, feeling a mixture of excitement and nerves that made her hands shake slightly as she prepared her simple breakfast. She had laid out her workout clothes the night before, the same basic black leggings and plain t-shirt she had been training in for weeks. As Margaret walked toward the community center, she could see crowds of people already gathering in the large field behind the building where the challenges had been set up. Colorful banners and flags decorated the area, and volunteers were busy making final preparations for the day's events. The atmosphere felt like a festival, with families bringing chairs and picnic blankets to watch the competition. Margaret arrived wearing her discount store athletic clothes and carrying a small water bottle, feeling immediately out of place among the other participants. Everywhere she looked, people were dressed in expensive, coordinated workout outfits that probably cost more than Margaret earned in a week. Their gear looked professional and serious, while Margaret felt like she was playing dress-up in someone else's clothes. The registration check-in table was surrounded by confident athletes stretching and chatting casually about their training routines and past competition experiences. Margaret recognized several faces from 6 weeks ago, including the blonde woman who had registered her with such obvious doubt. These people looked exactly the same as they had before, while Margaret knew she had changed in ways no one could see just by looking at her. As Margaret waited in line to check in, she overheard conversations that made her stomach flutter with nervousness. Participants were discussing their personal trainers, expensive gym memberships, and specialized diets they have followed to prepare for today. One man was explaining his detailed training schedule that included daily workouts with professional coaches and weekend boot camps. When Margaret reached the check-in table, the same blonde volunteer looked at her with surprise, as if she had forgotten Margaret had registered at all. She searched through the paperwork for Margaret's name while commenting that she was glad Margaret had decided to go through with participating. Her tone suggested she still found Margaret's presence at the competition somewhat amusing rather than inspiring. The challenges were laid out across the field like stations at a county fair, each one more intimidating than Margaret had imagined. The rope climbing station featured thick ropes hanging from tall wooden frames that seemed to reach toward the clouds. The obstacle course looked like something designed for military training, with walls to climb over, tunnels to crawl through, and barriers to jump across. An announcer with a loud microphone began explaining each challenge to the gathered crowd of participants and spectators. The rope climb would test upper body strength and technique. The obstacle course would measure agility, coordination, and problem-solving under pressure. The endurance run was a 3-mile course through the hills surrounding town. Strength tests included lifting weighted objects and completing as many pull-ups as possible in 2 minutes. Margaret listened carefully to every instruction, while other participants chatted and laughed, clearly confident about their abilities to handle whatever challenges were presented. She noticed several people pointing at her and whispering, probably wondering why the quiet librarian thought she belonged in such an athletic competition. As the first group of participants was called to begin, Margaret felt her heart pounding in her chest like a drum. All around her, athletic people were doing warm-up exercises that looked complicated and professional. Margaret stuck to the simple stretches she had learned during her secret training, trying to calm her nerves and focus on remembering everything she had practiced. The crowd of spectators was growing larger, with families and friends gathering to cheer for their favorite participants. Margaret realized she was probably the only person competing who had no one there to support her, but instead of feeling sad about that, she felt a strange sense of freedom. No one expected anything from her, which meant she could focus entirely on doing her personal best. Margaret took a deep breath and reminded herself of all the early mornings she had spent training in her living room, all the time she had pushed through discomfort and doubt to become stronger than she had ever been before. Today was her chance to show the world, and more importantly herself, what she was truly capable of accomplishing. When Margaret's group was called to the first challenge, she walked to the rope climbing station with quiet determination, while other participants strutted confidently toward their ropes. The thick rope felt familiar in her hands after weeks of secret practice in her apartment building's basement, and she approached it with the calm focus she had developed during her early morning training sessions. The whistle blew, and Margaret began climbing with smooth, efficient movements that surprised everyone watching. While other climbers struggled and grunted their way up the rope using mostly arm strength, Margaret used the technique she had researched and practiced, wrapping the rope around her feet and using her legs to support her body weight as she pulled herself steadily upward. Margaret reached the top of her rope in what felt like seconds, rang the bell that marked completion, and descended with controlled movements that looked almost effortless. When she looked around, she realized she had finished before everyone else in her group, including a muscular young man who was still only halfway up his rope and breathing heavily from the effort. A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd of spectators who had expected to see the quiet librarian struggle with the physical demands of the challenge. Margaret heard someone say they could not believe what they had just witnessed, and she felt a warm glow of pride spreading through her chest, like sunshine breaking through clouds. The obstacle course was next, and Margaret approached it with the same calm confidence she had discovered during her training. She had practiced similar movements in the park during her early morning sessions, crawling under benches and jumping over barriers when no one else was around to watch. The course that looked intimidating to others felt like a playground to Margaret. She moved through each obstacle with intelligence and efficiency, finding the best path through each challenge rather than trying to power through with brute force. While other participants got stuck or tired themselves out by rushing, Margaret maintained a steady pace that allowed her to complete the entire course without stopping to rest or catch her breath. When Margaret finished the obstacle course, she was surprised to see that several participants were still working on obstacles she had completed minutes earlier. The crowd was buzzing with excited conversation, and she heard people asking each other who the woman in the plain clothes was and where she had learned to move like that. The endurance run was where Margaret had worried she might struggle the most, but her weeks of gradually increasing her daily runs had prepared her better than she realized. She started at a comfortable pace while other runners sprinted ahead, confident that her strategy of steady endurance would serve her better than their early speed. One by one, Margaret began passing runners who had started too fast and were now walking or jogging slowly with exhausted expressions on their faces. Her breathing remained controlled and even, and her legs felt strong and capable of carrying her much further than the required 3 miles. The hills that had once seemed impossible during her first training runs now felt manageable and familiar. Margaret finished the endurance run in the top group of participants, still breathing normally while others around her were gasping for air and looking pale from exhaustion. She had not only completed the challenge successfully, but had done it with energy to spare, which surprised her as much as it surprised everyone watching. The strength tests were the final challenges, and Margaret approached them with growing confidence. The pull-up bar felt like an old friend after weeks of practice on the playground equipment, and she completed more repetitions than many participants half her age. The weighted lifting challenges revealed muscles that had been built through creative training with water jugs and heavy books. As Margaret completed each strength test with solid performance numbers, the crowd's attitude toward her shifted completely from amusement to genuine respect and admiration. People were no longer whispering about whether she belonged there, but instead were asking each other how someone they had never noticed before had become such an impressive athlete. Margaret felt a joy and confidence flowing through her body that was completely new and wonderful. She was not just participating in the challenges, she was excelling at them, proving to herself and everyone else that quiet strength could be just as powerful as flashy confidence. After all the challenges were completed, participants and spectators gathered around the main stage where the results would be announced. Margaret stood quietly toward the back of the crowd, still feeling amazed by her own performance throughout the day. She had accomplished more than she had ever dreamed possible, and regardless of the official results, she already felt like a winner. The event organizers took their time calculating scores and verifying results while the crowd waited with growing excitement. Margaret noticed that many people kept looking in her direction and whispering to each other, clearly surprised by the quiet librarian's unexpected athletic abilities. She overheard fragments of conversations where people were trying to figure out who she was and where she had been hiding such impressive fitness skills. The blonde woman who had registered Margaret weeks earlier approached with a bewildered expression on her face. She introduced herself properly for the first time, explaining that she was the community center's fitness director and that she had never seen anyone improve so dramatically in such a short time. She asked Margaret about her training routine and background, genuinely curious about how someone had prepared so effectively in secret. Margaret answered the questions honestly, explaining her simple home workout routine and creative use of everyday items as exercise equipment. The fitness director seemed amazed that Margaret had achieved such results without expensive equipment, personal trainers, or gym memberships. She kept shaking her head in disbelief while complimenting Margaret's dedication and natural athletic ability. Other participants began approaching Margaret as well, including some of the same people who had whispered and laughed when she registered. The muscular young man who had struggled with the rope climb asked for tips on technique, and the women in expensive workout clothes wanted to know about Margaret's training schedule and diet plans. Their attitudes had completely changed from amusement to genuine respect and admiration. When the announcer finally called for attention, the crowd grew silent with anticipation. The results would be announced starting with third place and working up to the overall champion. Margaret listened as names were called for various age group categories and special recognition awards, feeling proud of everyone who had participated and finished the challenging course. The announcement of third place overall went to a young man who had been expected to win based on his impressive appearance and confident attitude. Second place was awarded to one of the women in expensive gear who had been discussing her professional training routine. Margaret felt happy for both winners and was preparing to applaud politely for whoever had earned first place. When the announcer called Margaret's name as the overall champion of the entire fitness challenge, the silence that followed was so complete that Margaret wondered if she had misheard. Then the crowd erupted in the loudest cheers and applause of the entire day, with people whistling and shouting congratulations. Margaret stood frozen in shock, unable to believe that her name had been called for the top prize. The walk to the stage felt like walking through a dream as Margaret made her way through the cheering crowd toward the podium. The trophy was larger and more beautiful than she had expected, and when it was placed in her hands, Margaret felt tears of joy welling up in her eyes. She had not only participated in the competition, she had won it completely. During the brief interview that followed, Margaret spoke quietly into the microphone about the importance of believing in yourself and never giving up on dreams that seem impossible. She thanked everyone for their support and encouragement, even though she knew many of them had not expected her to succeed. Her words were simple but heartfelt, and the crowd responded with more applause and cheers. Local newspaper reporters approached Margaret after the ceremony, wanting to write stories about her incredible transformation and unexpected victory. They asked about her training methods, her motivation, and her plans for the future. Margaret found herself enjoying the attention and feeling proud to share her story with others who might be inspired by her example. As the event began winding down and people started heading home, Margaret stood holding her trophy and feeling like she was living in a completely different life than the one she had woken up to that morning. The woman who had been invisible and overlooked for so many years was now the center of attention and admiration. Monday morning arrived with Margaret waking up naturally before her alarm, feeling refreshed and energized in ways that had nothing to do with her physical fitness routine. The trophy from the weekend sat on her kitchen table, catching the early sunlight and reminding her that everything about her life had changed in the most wonderful way possible. She was still the same person inside, but now she carried herself with confidence that radiated from deep within. Walking to work that morning felt completely different than it had for the past 15 years. People who had never acknowledged her existence before were stopping to congratulate her and ask questions about her training methods. The elderly man who ran the corner newsstand shook her hand and said he had been inspired by her story in the local newspaper. Children pointed at her and whispered excitedly to their parents about the lady who had surprised everyone at the big competition. At the library, Margaret's coworkers greeted her with genuine enthusiasm and respect that she had never experienced before. They wanted to hear all about the fitness challenge and were amazed by the transformation their quiet colleague had undergone without any of them noticing. Margaret found herself enjoying the attention and conversation in ways that surprised her, feeling comfortable talking about her accomplishments and experiences. The most significant change was in how Margaret felt about herself throughout each day. Tasks that had once seemed overwhelming or intimidating now felt manageable because she had proven to herself that she was capable of achieving things that had once seemed impossible. When difficult library patrons complained or made unreasonable demands, Margaret responded with calm authority and confidence that commanded immediate respect. 2 weeks after the competition, Margaret decided to do something that would have terrified the old version of herself. She approached the community center about starting a fitness program for people who felt intimidated by traditional gyms and athletic environments. Her idea was to create a welcoming space where beginners could learn proper techniques and build confidence without worrying about judgment or comparison to others. The fitness director, who had been so surprised by Margaret's performance, immediately supported the idea and offered her free use of community center facilities. Word spread quickly through town, and Margaret found herself with a waiting list of people who wanted to join her program. Many were older adults who had given up on fitness, while others were younger people who had always felt too self-conscious to exercise in public. Margaret's fitness classes became the most popular program at the community center within a month. Her gentle teaching style and understanding of what it felt like to be a beginner made her students feel safe and encouraged. She shared her creative training methods using household items and emphasized that expensive equipment was not necessary for achieving real results. The woman who had once spent her evenings alone with books and cats now had a calendar filled with fitness classes, training sessions, and social activities with her new community of friends. Margaret discovered that helping others find their own hidden strength was even more rewarding than her personal victory at the competition. Margaret's apartment began filling with thank you cards from students who had achieved their own fitness goals under her guidance. Former couch potatoes were running their first 5K races. Elderly people were rediscovering activities they had enjoyed in their youth, and shy teenagers were building confidence that extended far beyond physical fitness into other areas of their lives. The local newspaper wrote follow-up articles about Margaret's growing influence in the community and her innovative approach to fitness education. She was invited to speak at schools and community events about the importance of believing in yourself and never accepting limitations that others try to place on you. Margaret still lived in the same small apartment and worked at the same library, but her life had expanded in ways she could never have imagined. She had learned that transformation was not about becoming a different person, but about discovering and embracing the strength and potential that had always existed within her. The quiet librarian had become a source of inspiration for everyone around her, proving that the most powerful changes often come from the most unexpected places. Every morning when Margaret looked in the mirror, she saw someone who had chosen courage over comfort and discovered that the greatest victories come not from defeating others, but from refusing to give up on yourself.